Shane, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to be working with you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So, for people who might not be familiar with you or the FAI fix or any of the amazing things that you and your team are doing, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are?
Sure. My name is Shane Dowd. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, corrective exercise specialist, massage therapist, and flexibility and mobility teacher. And you mentioned the website, the FAI Fix. That's one of my specialty programs, which is most near and dear to my heart. It's about hip impingement. So people can have all kinds of hip pain, but there's this specific type of hip pain that is, in layman's terms, called hip impingement, and in technical terms, femoral acetabular impingement. Something that I had, something that I was told I was going to need surgery for in my 20s. And then through a lot of trial and error, study and practice, spending a bunch of money, I came out of it without surgery, fixed my hips without surgery, created the FAIFix.com with my business partner and friend, Matt Shu. And so now I help people broadly with fixing pain and getting flexible, but I also help people very specifically with hip impingement. So that's what that website is about.
That's awesome. And it sounds like your own kind of past experience in hip pain and, being told you need surgery in your 20s ultimately led to the creation and formation of this.
Yeah, it was like, I got an x-ray and an MRI and the doctors were telling me like, it's not looking good for you, buddy. Like, don't be dumb. Get surgery now young so that it doesn't get worse. That was over 14 years ago and it hasn't gotten worse. In fact, it's gotten a lot better. If you've seen any of my YouTube videos, you can tell that, I can do the splits. I'm reasonably strong. I can run, play sports, do anything without any pain or movement problems. So the whole theory that if you have FAI, if you have hip impingement, it's inevitably going to lead to a whole range of problems and there's nothing you can do but shave the bones, fell short in my case. And then now that I've been helping people for the past 7 years, that's definitely not the case for a lot of people. Surgery is not the only option for hip impingement.
Yeah, exactly. Now, for you, what was your own experience like? I'm curious, what led you to the doctor in the first place, even, Shane? Were you having pain or were you getting kind of that stereotypical pinchy type sensation, or what led you down that rabbit hole?
Well, what's interesting for me is, there's a saying in physical therapy or in the strength and conditioning kind of like communities. I guess it's a model, the joint by joint approach to training, popularized by Mike Boyle and Gray Cook and those guys. And basically it points out that if one of your joints, say the hip, is not moving as much as it should or could, it's often another joint above or below that's going to compensate and move more than it should. So in my case, my hip was not moving as much as it should or could, and my back started moving more than it could. So when I was doing Olympic weightlifting, snatching, cleaning, squatting, deadlifting, I'd be compensating on a subtle level that I never noticed up until around 2011. And my back was the thing that kept getting injured. I kept getting these reoccurring SI joint, low back injuries. And it started to get so bad where like I couldn't do anything. I couldn't, sit in child's pose in yoga. I couldn't do an overhead squat with an empty barbell without re-injuring my back. So for me, it wasn't the classic sort of like front hip pinch, although, in my entire journey, there's also been groin pain and hip pinch and hip pain. But the first thing that happened was reoccurring back injuries that led me to seek out, getting the x-rays and the MRIs and the doctors, and they confirmed, yeah, you have a labral tear, you have subchondral cysts, you've got cam deformity, weirdly shaped bone. And so, yeah.
That's not an abnormal thing. I think a lot of people are walking around with back pain, and I think a lot of people are always looking for the cause of that. And I love how you brought in the regional interdependence approach of, essentially the body is a kinetic chain, and movement deficits in one area can really cause deficits or deficiencies or pain or, whatever term you want to throw at it in other areas as well, right? Like I've seen individuals who really pronate their feet a lot and they actually come to me with hip pain. Now, is that correlated? Is it a causation effect? It depends on, your treatment and how effective it is, I would say. But certainly interesting to note the movement patterns that people present with. As you mentioned, it's not necessarily something that needs surgery. The bone itself doesn't necessarily need to be shaved in every case, I would say.
Exactly. And there's a lot of scientific studies now that kind of prove that if you have bad bone shapes, it doesn't automatically mean that you have big hip problems. There's plenty of people that on x-rays and MRIs, it shows cam, pincher morphology, mixed impingement, and they don't have any pain or movement problems. And so it's not just like a one-to-one correlation of bad bones equals labrum tears and arthritis and problems and all kinds of stuff like that. And so it's good for the average person to know that if they're told they have these bad bone shapes, there's things that they can do non-surgically that are the low-hanging fruit: movement training, strength and conditioning, self-massage, tissue work, myofascial release, stretching, motor control. All these are like the low-hanging fruits that you should definitely try before you opt for something that's much more expensive, much more invasive.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, once you get surgery, you can't really undo it. You can't go back. But the nice thing about exercise is, even if you beat yourself up a little bit and you're sore and achy, give it a couple days and you'll probably see that all subside. And you mentioned an interesting point there as well about the intra-articular side of things, looking at the labrum, looking at the overall cartilage in the hip joint, and how there's really not a strong correlation between impingement presence and cartilage defects or labrum pathology and that sort of thing. And I think it's essential to note as well that all the things that you mentioned previously there about range of motion and strength, I mean, that's kind of the fountain of youth combo there for a joint. If you want to keep it well preserved and make some of the naturally occurring structures last a long time, maintain range of motion, maintain the strength of the joint and all the muscles around it, because if you don't, that's the kind of stuff that I could see kind of contributing to the early wear and tear more than just like a mild deformity.
Totally. And I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because it's that magic combination of the joint mobility and the control and the strength. And sometimes people have, no joint mobility, and they need to focus on regaining it with mobility exercises, stretching, deep targeted tissue work. But there's also other people that do fall into the category of hypermobile joints with hip pain. And those people often will respond a lot more to stabilization and strengthening and motor control. And then there's people who need a little bit of both.
Where that gets interesting is, when you think about FAI or a labral pathology for that matter as well, typically, when you flex the hip past a certain point, there's usually some type of sharp, pinchy feeling. Usually starts in the hip joint and it'll radiate into the groin in some individuals. I've had people tell me that they'll step and they get pain in their hip when it happens. They'll feel it when they're running. They just feel tight and stiff and achy. And most people, when that happens, I think they kind of look more at the rest and avoid activity because, well, it hurts. And based on what we've discussed so far, Shane, it sounds like resting is kind of the last thing we want to do to manage this. What do you think?
Yeah, that's another really great point, because I think about the average person who has some kind of hip problem going on, and they're going to go to their doctor, and probably the advice that they're going to get more than any other piece of advice is just rest. Just take it easy, don't do anything. But that doesn't teach your body how to move better. If your muscles are very dense and tight, it doesn't get them to kind of become more supple and softer, and which can, in my mind, be one of the things that most immediately takes away your pain. Is like some really deep targeted pinpoint tissue work supported by some strengthening, some reactivation or activation exercises, some stretching. But I think the just rest approach is only really appropriate for the first short period of time after like an insult and injury, where you just want to just take it easy. Don't try to go squat the next day if you just really pissed off and inflamed your hip. Take it easy, but very quickly thereafter start to move gently and mindfully and start to teach your body, okay, this much range of motion is safe. Okay, now a little more. It's like keep expanding what your body can do, how much load it can tolerate, the ranges of motion that it can tolerate. And don't baby yourself. Neither do you want to be a knucklehead and just jump right back into extreme exercise, nor do you want to baby yourself and do absolutely nothing for weeks and months on end.
Right. You have to kind of follow a phased progression back into things. And, as you mentioned, it's okay to take a day or two off if you really flare things up, because if you're in a ton of pain, loading a already painful joint or painful motion is not going to help it by any means. It's okay to restart activity within a few days and start with simple stuff, right? Stretching or light exercise, or I'm a huge fan of isometric exercise for early on in the process. Like, it's okay to kind of hit the reset button and take a week or two and build back up, and that won't necessarily set you miles behind. Sometimes that can really save seasons for people and get you back into, more of a long-term focus instead of just a short-term ache and pain, put the fire out, and then another one starts, and then you put that one out. Like, ultimately, I think we have to break that perpetual cycle, I guess I'll say.
Exactly, yeah. I was explaining it to my wife recently because she's like my workout buddy. And so we go to the gym and, we've been, training together now for like a couple of years. And there's been a time or two where she like got a little tweak here, deadlifting, and her back started to feel a little funky. And her initial reaction was, should I just stop doing everything? And I'm like, well, let's rest for a day or two. And then let's give you some gradual exposure. Let's deadlift something really light and then something a little heavier and a little heavier. And it's like, I think the recovery goes faster if it's that slow, gradual progression, which just teaches your body like, you're safe, you're safe, you're safe, little by little.
Structure doesn't always dictate function, right? And I know there's research to support this and that sort of thing as well. Like, just because something hurts does not mean that your structural deformity is a cause of it. So, in your wife's case, just because she had a little bit of aching or pain or that sort of thing when she was deadlifting doesn't mean that she should immediately go turn around and get an MRI. Imaging will show abnormalities on a variety of different people, but ultimately structure and function are not necessarily a direct correlation, right?
Yeah, and that's why I like the saying, you are not your x-ray, you are not your MRI. It's like, if I was like, I have my x-rays and my MRIs, and I've got scoliosis and the bad hip problems and the cysts on the bones. Like, I'm a mess on an x-ray and an MRI, and yet I have no pain or movement problems. That's just example of one, but I think it's really important to keep beating the drum on that, or keep giving that message out there, because so many people will go to the doctor, get an x-ray, get an MRI, and it's always going to find something wrong. It's always going to find something torn, bursting at the seam, coming out like your bulging disc out of your spine. And it's very easy when the doctor in the white lab coat is saying like, oh, look at this, you see what's going on here, this is ooh, and you can freak out and get scared. So yeah, it's an important message.
Yeah, for sure. So walk me through your process and the FAI fix there, if you don't mind, as far as, how you went from the period of time where you were in pain, you were tight, you were limited in what you could do, and how you've progressed back to the point now where you can pretty much be physically limitless, for lack of a better way to put it.
I kind of grew up, my first and earliest mentors and coaching experiences were, my mentor was Carl Valley, he was coaching an Olympic track athlete named Hector Cotto. And so I was brought up as a classically trained kind of strength coach. And so when I started suffering these back problems and these hip problems, I started coming at it from kind of like through the eyes of a strength guy. So I tried to strengthen things, and that helped a little bit, but it didn't fully take me out of my pain. And so I was like, well, I just moved to California. These Californians are all into this like hippie yoga stuff. I'm gonna go try yoga. Maybe stretching and flexibility is what I'm missing. So I did the strength coach stuff, added in the yoga and flexibility stuff, and that improved it a little bit more. But it wasn't until I found kind of like what for me was the third piece of the puzzle. I found this guy named Phil Pedichenko, who's a chiropractor, but he only does deep tissue, very like precise massage. It's like if you go to the average massage therapist and they're working on you kind of in a gentle way. Sometimes they go deep on one spot, but then they're kind of working on stuff for a while. With Phil, it was like you step into his office, and for 1 hour to 90 minutes straight, he's on the bullseye of all of your problems and just patiently working it out. Not at an intensity that's too much, but definitely not an intensity that's too little. It's like you have to start breathing and relaxing and kind of deal with the intensity. And so it was that third thing, the targeted tissue work, the precision massage, that combined with the classic strength and conditioning and kind of physical therapy strengthening that I had learned, plus the yoga and stretching and mobility. And, I found people like Kelly Starrett Mobility WOD, all kinds of other like flexibility and mobility influences. And then the deep targeted tissue work from Phil, and that combination, the massaging, the stretching, the strengthening, got me all the way out of my problems. And in that process, I went into a lot of chiropractors, physical therapists, massage therapists, experts, and everyone had their own philosophy. But I found it was pretty rare to find any one person who included all three of those pillars. Like your typical generic kind of physical therapy often only gave me strengthen your glutes and stretch your hip flexors. That's going to fix everything. And then the yoga classes just did stretching. They didn't include any kind of massage or strengthening. It was just stretching. And then, my strength coaching influences were just like, oh, you're just weak. Just your back hurts, make your back stronger. And so putting that all together for myself was the magic sauce. And so yeah, that's what made the biggest difference.
Yeah, exactly. I think you hit the nail on the head. At the end of the day, you're going to need more than a hot pack and a massage to actually get to the, underlying issues and correct them long term. And I agree with your point that, we typically see the best outcomes with combinations of treatments. The more we can combine improving range of motion, quality and quantity, and I think that's a key thing there with strength, the better off we're going to be. So just because someone has range in the sense of laxity and movement doesn't necessarily mean that they know how to use that. This is my opinion at this point. That's where I think I start to see more of the, muscular type pains, right? Hey, this feels tight or this feels achy, is when you have a lot of passive range, but you don't have the stability to back it up, things are going to tighten up and guard up and kind of act in more of a protective manner because you have mobility without stability to match it. You have too much WD-40 and not enough duct tape, for lack of a better way to put it.
That's great. I love that. It made me remember when that point first came home to me. I did trades with a lot of people when I was coming out of my own hip impingement problems. I was like, okay, I'll take you through a strength coach session. You take me through your yoga session and we'll learn from each other. And I did a session with this kind of famous yoga teacher in San Diego, California. She was super flexible, like, cold, would sit on the ground, put her legs open in a straddle and fall straight forward into the pancake splits, like full splits, no warm up. And I said, cool, let's check out some basic strength movements. Have you ever done an overhead squat? And so I gave her like a kind of a light bar and had her try an overhead squat. And because she didn't have the stability and the motor control to control her pelvis and space and her ribs, and her ribs were flaring up like crazy, putting her into a big anterior pelvic tilt. She couldn't even squat below parallel because she was like hyper mobile. She had plenty of hip and ankle mobility and shoulder mobility to overhead squat, but the lack of ability to control it all, like you said, was the missing piece. And so yeah, again, it's that combination of the right amounts of mobility and stability at every joint, and in a variety of positions. That's the key.
You mentioned previously that you kind of wear many hats yourself, from corrective exercise to strength coaching and so on that way. How do you kind of look to progress someone through exercises for yourself there? How do you kind of put all of the pieces together when it comes to building a program for someone to address these deficits? Because as well as I do, and one person will say they stretch as a warm-up and someone else will say, no, you can't do that. You have to stretch as a cool down. One person will say stretching isn't worth your while, and so on that way. So how do you kind of approach things and put all the pieces together?
It's a complicated question because it's so individual. It's like if someone walks in and they are super stiff and tight in every sense of the word, often, not always, but often, this is a guy. The guys that I've worked with, as a general rule of thumb, tend to be on the type O mobile, not mobile enough side. And the women often are on the hyper mobile, but it can also be the opposite of that. But let's say that the really stiff guy walks in and he wants to, feel good, not have any pain, have decent range of motion, and, build his body with a little bit of strength and conditioning. If he can't even get in safe biomechanical positions for the strength training, I'm going to stretch that guy and I'm going to do some mobility work and I'm going to do some tissue work to prepare his joints for the lifting of the weights that we're about to do. And that goes counter to some people's advice of like, never stretch before lifting weights. But I'm like, if we're doing it for a short period of time and it's combined with a thorough warm up, and this guy can't even get into safe positions unless we do this, then I'm going to do it a little bit with him. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, the yoga girl that I mentioned, if she came in, we wouldn't do any stretching before or after with her because she already has tons of passive range of motion. Unless her goal was to I need to maintain that and it's important to me, then we can include a little bit of flexibility and mobility in there. But that's just kind of an example of how individual it can be. Like for her to be maybe to get rid of her joint pain, her hip pain or something, she might need to do heavy RDLs like Romanian deadlifts and real progressive overload strength training might help her with her hip problems, maybe not more hip flexor stretches and pigeon pose.
No, I completely agree. I like the way that you brought that up. And, how often do coaches, providers, whatever you want to call it, assume things about their patients before they've even assessed them and evaluated them, right? You've mentioned the hip flexors, you've mentioned stretching a few different times. How often do we just stretch the hip flexors and just, assume that they're tight? How often do we assume that the tightness is due to, they just sit down a lot or something like that? We almost never look at the strength of the hip flexors. And a lot of times, at least in my own experience, I see a lot of people who have weak and tight hip flexors. So it's again, just doing one of the two is not necessarily going to address everything. But on that note, I kind of just mentioned postural considerations there. How does posture kind of play into the whole hip pathology role, I'll say? And is that something that you address in your programs? And how does posture kind of fit into everything?
Posture is a very broad term. We could be talking about your upper body posture. Usually when people say posture, they think about he has good posture or he has bad posture. But if we're talking about hip pain and stuff like that, more where my mind goes to is the positioning of your pelvis. There are a lot of people who, have the tight hip flexors, tight quads. They've sat a lot. Maybe they're a little bit in excessive anterior pelvic tilt. I think anterior pelvic tilt has gotten a bad rap these days. It's true. If I literally position your pelvis anteriorly and ask you to bring your knee to your chest, you're going to have less range of motion than if it's in a neutral kind of position. And you can try this for yourself. If anyone's listening, lay on your back, arch your back and stick your butt out and try to bring your knee to your chest, and you'll find it impinges quicker. And so you can kind of use that basic principle to say, okay, one possible thing that I could do to, if I'm stuck in that position, and if someone does, kind of an assessment on you and you feel like you're just stuck in that position a lot, you feel like if you look at yourself from the side, you got kind of that butt sticking out thing, then yeah, you could work on your posture of your hips by potentially doing some tissue work on the quads and psoas and iliacus and even the QL, quadratus lumborum muscles on the back, and get yourself into a more neutralist position. And you should be able to move in and out of all pelvic positions and control them. It's not like one is the best, but if that person gets themselves out of a quote unquote bad or less than ideal posture for hip impingement, then they'll probably start to find a little bit of relief for their hip impingement or a little bit of extra range of motion that they didn't have before.
Yeah. Has it ever surprised you assessing people and watching people move, how few people can actually control their pelvic rotation and pelvic movement, especially left versus right pelvic rotation?
Yeah, very, very much so. When I was sort of studying with the best physical therapists and chiropractors and healers that I could find, and there was this really high level D1, I think, football player who was trying to make it to the NFL. And my mentor, Carl, who I mentioned earlier, was doing some specialized training with him, trying to get him ready for the combine. And we took him to the physical therapist, and the physical therapist was trying to see if he could control his own pelvic motion. And he was like a stuck block. He literally could not figure out how to tip his pelvis in any which way, because he had just done years and years of hardcore football training, could squat and deadlift a ton, but was having back problems and he couldn't control his pelvis at all. So yeah, teaching that motor control is helpful as well.
Yeah, and you brought up a great point there in that example with the football player, Shane, is it sounds like he's an individual who had years and years and years of highly specialized training for football. And there's nothing wrong with that. It sounds like it made him an amazing football player. However, you also need to make sure you don't neglect the general physical preparation or the general movement while in that process. If I spent every single day deadlifting, I'd get great at the deadlift motion. But if I did deadlifts every single day for years on end, and then all of a sudden I decided, today, instead of deadlifting, I'm going to squat. My squat would probably look more like a deadlift than a squat. So I think it's important to, chase those highly specialized things to a certain extent, but also make sure you don't neglect the basic functional movement patterns or, fundamental movement systems, you could call it, while doing that, because you could even lose a lot in the way of progress and performance, not to mention, as you're doing that by neglecting some of the basic simple things, I would say.
And I think that the tricky part for the average person is those basic movements, or we could say like learning this subtle kind of refined motor control of your pelvis, or in the upper body, subtle refined movements of your scapula and your arm, and all of that stuff is not quite as fun and sexy as squatting and deadlifting heavy and like crushing it in the gym. So to get the average person to do it, that's the challenge that all of us strength coaches and physical therapists have to do. How do we make mobility training and motor control sexy, and how do we get people to integrate it into their life and their training without making it feel like, oh, one more thing that I have to do that I in the beginning can't see how this correlates to what I care about most, which is performance on the field or lifting more weights or going faster or whatever.
Yeah, it's certainly a long-term buy-in, and it's certainly more of a part of the process than the immediate gratification. I'm curious, from your standpoint, how do you get people to realize the importance of just in general taking care of themselves in this manner? How do you get them to recognize that, hey, some, soft tissue work, a little bit of active mobility, and some strengthening is actually going to help me, in the future? Is there any kind of like phrase that you use that really kind of gets people to recognize or realize the importance of what you're doing and why?
I learned a long time ago that the old like show them, don't tell them works a lot better. So if someone's coming in and they have pain, if I can do something or some things really quickly that take away their pain, and I say, hey, do this, you got back pain, take this weird looking tool, it's called the Body Back Buddy, it's this big blue S-shaped stick, hook it up to a band on a pole, and then hook it into your QL, do some trigger point work on your QL for 2, 3, 4 minutes, stand up, move your back around, and tell me how you feel. And they're like, oh my God, it just gone. Like I've done so much stretching, so much strengthening my core so my back pain will go away, and just a little bit of really precise trigger point release work on the muscle that's overly spasmed or dense or tight, and they instantly feel better. I might have just got a convert. And so one thing is there something I can do to take their pain away quickly? And then two, to kind of help get buy-in, help people want to continue mobility work in general, is always I try to connect it with what they care about most. So if they're a CrossFitter or someone who's like squatting, deadlifting, lunging, lifting weights in the gym, if I can make those gym movements be cleaner, deeper, smoother, more comfortable with a little bit of mobility work, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna do the mobility work, but then we're gonna go do the thing that you love, which is squatting. And if it feels better and you move better and deeper, and all of a sudden you can overhead squat better because you're more upright and not bent over like crazy because your hips and ankles are so tight, you're like, oh, like I can overhead squat much more now because my mobility improved. And so those two things, like giving them something that takes away their pain quickly, and making them do the test and the retest of like, we're going to test your squat before, do some mobility exercises, retest your squat afterwards, and you're going to see and feel in your body how it feels better. Those are probably the two most powerful things to get people to want to do this kind of stuff.
I love those two examples, Shane. Ideally, everyone that I know that's in pain is searching for a solution to it. And if you can give them that in a short period of time, especially in a non-invasive, non-pharmaceutical way, people are going to love you for that. And, that's not to demonize things like pharmaceuticals by any means, but they're not always the answer to every single problem. And sometimes there's other solutions, like we're just mentioning here. And, to your point as well, if you can improve performance by doing something simple, then imagine what, kind of performance gains you can make by kind of jumping into a full program to address a variety of different deficits. And imagine how high you can soar if you're routinely addressing those things and improving yourself.
Totally. Very well said. I I got nothing to add. That was perfect.
So Shane, for people, we've talked about the hips, we've talked about different exercise considerations, but I know you've kind of got a whole program that kind of addresses everything that we've already discussed. So, for people listening and maybe they want to check out that program a little bit, where can they find that at? Where can they find you at?
Yeah, I have two websites. One is thefaifix.com, which is all about FAI, hip impingement, femoroacetabular impingement. And then I have gotrom.com. ROM stands for range of motion. Gotrangeofmotion.com, gotrom.com. And that's the even broader kind of brand where I have all of my fixed pain and injury programs, all of my flexibility programs. So if you want to, if you want this sort of like what I call the TSR approach, tissue work, stretching, and re-education, or tissue work, stretching, and strengthening, this sort of combined approach, which we've mentioned is more effective than just the yoga stretching or just the strengthening or, just one of those modalities. All of my programs are those type of programs. So I got programs for neck pain and back pain and every pain you can imagine. And also flexibility programs ranging from beginner programs like touch your toes to advanced programs like do the splits. So all of that is at gotrom.com. So those are the two websites.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think if I remember correctly, you've even got some like free resources over on your Gotrom website. Is that correct?
Yeah, tons of free ebooks, which also come along with free videos. And then on my YouTube channel, if you just search Gotrom, there's 300 some odd free full-length videos and tutorials. And of course, I'm on all the other social medias. So if you just search Gotrom or Shane Dowd on Google or any social media, you'll find it.
Awesome. We can link to all of that in the description below as well. Shane, as we kind of start to wrap up here, is there any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks you have or anything that we might have missed?
The secret of your success is going to be found in your daily routine. It's not what you do occasionally that matters. It's what you do daily. I would encourage everyone to start daily mobility routine. It could be 10 to 15 minutes, nothing crazy. It can fit into your current fitness routine. Like, for example, I will lift weights, 4 or 5 days a week, and I'll just superset every strength exercise with a simple mobility exercise. So it doesn't actually end up taking more time. I would have just been sitting on my phone or, doing something, wasting my time in that 1 or 2 minute of rest. I could be doing something productive like mobility. So it doesn't have to be added or additional, but that daily consistency of some kind of mobility practice will do a lot for you.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, you're not going to go from, super stiff, haven't stretched in years to doing a split overnight. So if you chip away at it slowly and consistently over time, then you will eventually get there. But, don't expect immediate success here with these sort of things. Or if you do want immediate success, I would imagine it would hurt quite a bit.
Yeah, don't try to get immediate splits. That's not good.
That's awesome. Well, Shane, I really appreciate your time. I think this was an awesome episode. Thank you again for everything.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.